Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to another round of Internet Governance briefings. This time we obviously cover what has happened in April. We'll look a little bit into what is coming in May. As a reminder, or maybe an introduction to those of you that are with us for the first time, the goal of this briefing today is to try to run through main digital policy developments around the world. We'll also have a bit of a sneak peek into what happened in different regions, and the structure of the event goes like this. We start with three distinguished trends of the previous month. We'll have some of the experts on board. We'll have a special guest today as well. Then we'll look into what are other important developments globally, and look into what's coming in May out of the major events. Also, what Diplo will be offering to all of you in May. And finally, we'll do a round around the world, even if virtually, to see what has been happening around the world. I'm happy to thank to all the people behind Diplo and the GIP that helped developing this briefing today. In particular, my colleague Susonia, who will be the chat moderator during this event. So please feel free to use the chat to the largest possible extent. Susonia will follow. She will try to summarize occasionally, input some of the questions and comments. So try to be active. When it comes to main trends, my colleagues Stephanie, Katarina, and Pavlina will be with us to help explain what has happened. My colleague Marco in Geneva will run through what Diplo is providing us next month, and my colleague Andriana will help with what's coming when it comes to global events, as well as this tour around the globe. Let me not waste much more time. Let's move to the three trends of the month. So what we distinguished as the three main trends of this month, or April, are the following. Artificial intelligence came again under the spotlight when it comes to regulations and international negotiations. The second one is data leaks, data breaches. Well, what's the difference? We'll discuss. I'm sure you all read the various news about that again. And the third one is the particular, maybe new type of response that the US has announced with regards to cyber attacks, and particularly what we've seen in SolarWinds case. Now, let's start with the first trend, and that is the artificial intelligence. There are two particular aspects or particular updates which are relevant when it comes to artificial intelligence in April. The first one is the European approach to, or the new package about the artificial intelligence, where my colleague Katarina will drive through. And the second one is about the Group of Governmental Experts on little autonomous weapon systems, sometimes called as killer robots. And we'll have a special guest today, Ljupčo Jivan, who chaired the GG laws, the Group of Governmental Experts, so he'll join us shortly. But I would firstly pass the floor to my colleague Katarina. Katarina will drive us a little bit through what has happened when it comes to the EU AI package, what we can expect, what are the main components there. Katarina, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vlada. Hi, everyone. So as you said, let me drive through this development. So first of all, I think it's not an overstatement to say that this is a defining moment in the history of AI and the governance of AI. What we see proposed here is the harmonization of regulations between member states. We also see the attempt to provide a future-proof definition of AI and even new institutions. So what is really interesting and very noteworthy is that this regulation takes a risk-based approach. And that particular with the idea in mind to provide a proportionate regulation. I quote, to impose regulatory burdens only when an AI system is likely to pose high risks to fundamental rights and safety. So within this typology, we have three categories. We have unacceptable risks that are banned. We have AI applications associated with high risk. And here we have regulation in detail. And then low or minimal risk AI, which is addressed to a limited extent. And perhaps it's worth adding that the vast majority of AI applications that we can think of kind of fall in this category. Let me unpack this just a little bit to give you a bit of a flavor. So what is banned, for example? Here we have AI systems that materially distort a person's behavior, that are exploiting the vulnerabilities of a specific group of persons, that are used for public social scoring, or that are used for what is called real-time remote biometric identification systems. So for example, facial recognition technology in publicly accessible spaces. For the first two categories, there also needs to be psychological or physical harm associated. What is perhaps noteworthy is that a lot of these are not established legal categories. And also noteworthy, there's an exception for remote biometric identification systems, in particular when it comes to public security interest. Vlada, shall I go on or shall I stop here?
Well, if you have maybe another highlight, why not? And then we'll turn further. Yep.
Okay, then let me talk about high risk and some of the critique that we've heard over the last couple of days. So high risk systems, the second category, the category that is very highly regulated, relates to, for example, critical infrastructure, AI systems that are used in educational institutions or in the context of employment. And here the regulation sets kind of a high bar of requirements, high quality data, documentation and traceability, transparency, human oversight, accuracy, and robustness. We will get into more details on this in our April newsletter, but perhaps let me just give you a flavor of some of the critique that we heard over the last couple of days. So there's first, there's sometimes vague terminology that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. We also see what could be called loopholes. So when we talk about biometric identification systems, facial recognition, as I said, this is limited to real-time use and public spaces. And then we see exceptions, as I mentioned, again, for biometric identification systems, facial recognition. When it comes to public security interest, there is an exception being made on the ban. There are a couple of other things that I could talk about, and perhaps that's something we can do in the chat or if people have questions, which is basically what about the application of this regulation beyond the EU? What about implementation? And what really is this future-proof definition of AI that we are promised here? So over to you, Vlada, and then perhaps comments and questions in the chat or later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katarina. We'll definitely have time to come back to that. I again encourage all of you to use chat to the maximum potential and raise your thoughts about this, questions, comments. We'll get back to them shortly. And I think Katarina already outlined a couple of very interesting questions. One of those, to what extent the future EU regulation or whatever the form it will take or would take could have a global impact, maybe similar to the GDPR and setting the standards and so on. But before that, let's move to the other side of probably the same coin. And that is the lethal autonomous weapon systems, many times referred to killer robots. It's probably not always the best alternative title. But I have my pleasure to introduce our second guest, or the main guest of this briefing today is Ljupčo Jivan. Ljupčo is a diplomat of North Macedonia. He has vast experience in diplomacy, but he also chaired this group of governmental experts on laws or lethal autonomous weapon systems. Now, Ljupčo, many thanks for joining us. You have a bright sunlight in the background. It's good. The weather is changing to positive. I'll pass the floor to you with a simple question, understanding that we have been covering on the Digital Watch for quite some time the laws, the GG and the work in laws, but I'm not sure how many people actually know about the system, where it comes from, and what are the main discussion points and the weight of the process. So maybe just outline also the context of the GG laws and certainly what is the best, what is the benefit that we got from this chair statement and the closing of this round of the process at the moment. Ljupčo.
Thank you very much, Vlada, and thanks again for inviting me. You're right, we just finished less than 2 weeks ago, the year 2020. The reason why we did so in April and not in November is would have been is the tradition every year. Is obviously the COVID situation, the global pandemic that has affected everything, including multilateral work. And it has affected the work of the group as well. I start with this and I'll come back to it, but just to give it, because this is, you asked me about context, and this is one very important part of that context. But to come back a few steps ahead. I've said before, and I'll say it again, I said it after our work finished in 2019, that this is the most advanced normative discussion, deliberation, on anything involving machine learning, artificial intelligence, globally. This is not to reduce the value of such inputs to the global processes as the one that Katarina mentioned coming from the EU. But as impactful as I expect it to be, it is still a regional initiative. This is a multilateral work on a specific issue, and that is how machine learning is affecting the future of warfare, how it will affect the future of warfare. And this is the result of 4 years' work, with a few years before as meeting of experts, but the GGE as such exists in its 5th year, it's entered right now. And what it has achieved in that short period of time is really, I think, the speed of light in multilateral time. I think that for many, perhaps the wish is to have a faster process, to go further, to already have a treaty for some, to ban it for others. But to be able to come to this stage in 4 years, which is to be able to have 11 guiding principles, to have discussed in depth what it means to do a legal review of weapons in detail for these kinds of emerging technologies, what are possible laws that already apply, both national and international, to focus on legal, technological, and military aspects as separate parts, and then to also see the interlinkage between them. And to also, what we did in 2019, agree on a 2-year mandate, ending at the end of this year with the review conference, is quite a big thing. So where are we right now? We are in a 2nd year of this 2-year mandate. The 1st year was expected to be a year to really set the stage, and we've done that. There were deliberations as much as was possible last year under circumstances, as we all know. And the chair's summary that you've mentioned is an attempt by the chair in my personal capacity to map that out, to see, okay, this is what we've discussed. This is what has come up as needing perhaps more attention. This is something that we've discussed enough, and perhaps we can, at least for the time being, put aside so that we can focus on other things. These are elements that we've come to some greater detail of understanding, of granularity, as I've termed it. And it's an attempt really to ease the process in this final year ahead of the review conference. So it's a highly complex issue. You mentioned in the beginning, popularly called killer robots. That is one simplification that, in my opinion, doesn't do service to the process, because it gives an image of either a drone or a robot like the Terminator killing, where this is actually much more complex. We're talking about autonomy in the critical functions of weapons that can be used on and under the sea, on land, in air, in cyberspace, in space. So it's not to be underestimated with such simplifications. It's highly complex, and I really think that the group has done an amazing job in the past few years to come to a fruitful conclusion of these 4 years and prepare the ground ahead of the review conference later this year, or perhaps early next year.
Thank you, Ljupčo. I think this definitely deserves more of discussion and probably a separate meeting, and we'll certainly invite you for maybe a separate webinar. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions in the chat, but I want to start with one question, firstly probably to you, and then back to Katarina. These are the two processes that obviously, well, it happened that in April, both of them somehow came up with some sort of results and a peak in interest. I wonder whether these two processes are in any way connected when it comes to the thematic coverage, or whether one can support another. I mean, the laws discussions support the global AI regulation or the European, and vice versa. Are there any connected dots that we can use and connect the process and impact each other? Ljupčo.
Absolutely. The EU is obviously a critical actor, a very active actor in this process. Both its member states and the EU as well, as a union. As we all know, it is not easy to come to consensus within the EU and to have positions on any topic. And that the reason because of that is because so many different interests are presented within the EU already. So what comes out is already quite a clear position on most issues, including this one. So this is why I say that when the EU has already reached an agreement internally on a given position, that can be a very powerful voice when it acts as a union in all multilateral fora, including in this one. And there are a lot of aspects that are certainly relevant to both. Katarina mentioned that the focus of this EU regulation comes from the point of view of risks. In terms of unacceptable risk and high risks and what are, so already this gives an indication that of views that can reflect and into the work of the GG. But at the same time, what is at risk? What are we talking about? When we start dissecting what we're talking about in terms of artificial intelligence at this stage, we're talking about really machine learning with high computing power based on a lot of data. So the data is the critical aspect here, which is a critical aspect in the deliberations in the GG on laws as well. And we are starting to really uncover that as well, especially, for instance, for swarm technologies, but also in others, this black box problem. What is the outcome? Why is this specific, whatever, weapon or drone or whatever it is, behaving the way it is behaving? Can we explain it? Is there a degree of predictability that we're comfortable with? What is not a degree of predictability? But really, to conclude, the unacceptable risk is for this process to stall, to finish. And we've been successful so far to really keep it going. Whenever we've come to a stumbling block, what is the definition of autonomous weapon? What is this? What is that? We've been able to navigate around it. And it's really, multilateral work is like a really big ocean-faring cruise ship, and you don't want to be the evergreen, evermore ship when you're crossing and a sandstorm comes in. Similarly with this, we've been able to always, whenever we come to some kind of a roadblock, to a narrow passage, we've been able to navigate around that. And we keep on doing that. And hopefully that will continue to go. So the unacceptable risk is for this process to stall. And we've managed to avoid that. And hopefully that remains the case. And the process stays in Geneva. Thanks.
And thanks for mentioning Geneva. It's always, this discussion, what happens in Geneva, what's happening in New York. And I think it's very important what you underlined, the benefits that the multilateral process brings, even if we don't really always see it. Sometimes we expect, an agreement and something bumpy, but actually these are the small steps in the process which helps. We'll get back to that and to questions from you. I just wanted to come back quickly to Katarina with the same question, basically. So Katarina, what Ljupčo underlined was that there are building blocks which are same when it comes to the laws and the European or general AI regulation. On the other hand, if I understand correctly, the European regulation strictly says that it doesn't really want to look into military purposes. So are there any links, and how can maybe this clear position of EU help shaping other processes like the laws? Katarina.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. So it's very important to stress that the regulation states it shall not apply to AI systems developed or used exclusively for military purposes. So I think this kind of this word exclusively is something we should note. And we all know that AI applications can be used in various different ways. There's always this dual use question kind of in the background. The other thing we should note is that this particular regulation is very much focused on practice, so how these systems are used and the risk associated with that. So that means in terms of development or research, that is not really covered by the regulation. On the positive side, I think it's great, as you said, in terms of providing a more unified vision to kind of also introduce a kind of predictability on what the EU is exactly standing for when it comes to the regulation of AI. There's quite some definitional work. There's quite some detailed work in kind of teasing apart what is unacceptable for us to use, what is really contrary to the values of the European Union. Quite some definitional work on what is considered high risk, and some definitional work, as I mentioned, on the term AI itself. So that's extremely useful. And just in terms of drawing ideas and further insights from that, I would definitely underscore it as a huge achievement.
Thanks, Katarina. Well, I would have a million of questions to both of you now, but let me pass the floor to Sonia. Sonia has been following the chat, and I guess there are a lot of comments, or I would at least have a number of questions. Sonia, anything striking from the chat, whether as a summary or particular questions?
Well, yeah, many things are striking in the chat, and initially about the general global AI regulation by certain countries and by the EU and the USA was discussed, and whether proposed EU regulation, once it becomes a reality, how it would affect the other parts of the world and other countries, and would it have an effect similar to the GDPR? And also Stefan said maybe it would be the other way around, and with the bill, the Chinese approach, like the UNESCO plans would fit into the EU proposed regulations, but later on down the discussion, we were reminded like how this is still in the draft position, and there would be a lot of lobbying from different parties until this becomes an official regulation. And for Ljupčo, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. There was two specific questions. One is, well, maybe not so specific, but it's like, what is in store for the GGE on laws, and the kind of or perceived conflict between what the UN Secretary. Whoa.
We see you now.
Yes, UN Secretary General Guterres is calling the ban on laws, and not only for a moratorium. So was there any reply or response from the big players in the GGE? Would be.
Thank you, Sonia. Quite interesting. So maybe I'll pass the floor firstly to Katarina and then to Ljupčo. And by the way, I have the exclusivity of being able to read Ljupčo's name and surname coming from the same region. Ljupčo and Gjorgjinski. It's quite complicated. But let me pass the floor firstly to Katarina. So Katarina, certainly the response to any of those thoughts, and what I think is quite interesting is, what do you think can happen next, not only in EU, but what can we expect, how the other processes such as Chinese, the UN process, could impact this shaping of global regulations? Katarina.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, as I said before, it's this proposal for the regulation is really useful in clearly understanding of where the EU is standing. When we look at the GDPR, we had a lot of discussions on the EU acting as a norm entrepreneur because it has such a detailed regulation on data. That is something that is certainly kind of shaping the discussion in other regions. If you look at the relationship to the US and China, again, it's certainly useful to see where the EU is exactly standing. In terms of any tensions, for example, if you look at the EU and the US, it is very obvious that they are taking very different approaches to regulation and come from a very different starting point. However, I wouldn't see this as creating more tension than, for example, the GDPR did. So I think overall, I think this is a very positive step, not in terms of creating additional tension, but just very clearly stating where the EU is standing and doing it in such a clear way that other regions, other countries have a very clear idea, and possibly even shaping the discussion by doing so. As you mentioned, we obviously have a coordination problem when it comes to other initiatives, such as UNESCO's ethical framework. But I think it's useful to remind ourselves that UNESCO is working on an ethical framework, and here we're looking at a very specific regulation for the European market.
Thanks. Well, back to Ljupčo with a similar question. Ljupčo, to what extent the other processes actually impact the discussions of the GG laws, and not only that, vice versa. We had some mentions there, such as the UN or Secretary General's digital cooperation roadmap, where we also had one of the recommendations related to AI, that the AI shouldn't decide on matters of life and death. And then we had all these discussions about cybersecurity, the GG also, the UN GG and the UN Open-Ended Working Group. How do you see the interplay of let's say, your GG on laws with these other many processes? So, Ljupčo, back to you.
Thanks, Lada, and thanks, Katarina, as well, for giving so much important context, like the one that you have in terms of the EU being a norm entrepreneur, and it has been in the past on critical issues in cyberspace. If not the EU, the Council of Europe on whatever is illegal offline is illegal online, and this has reverberated all over the world in terms of the repercussions of understanding what that means. And there are others as well. The GDPR, it presents an issue at which it has looked at in great depth. It has deliberated on it in several different layers of its governance structures and among the different member states, and then it comes with a given position. So that in itself has a lot of value in terms of understanding any given issue, and this is not an exception in this case, because it is such a complex issue. I see in some of the comments, Richard Hill has mentioned that we've had autonomy in that sense for a long time, but there's obviously something slightly different with the machine learning speed that we've seen in other areas. The speed at which a very narrow type of intelligence is achieved, but still very, very high intelligence in a very narrow field is achieved with the new aspects of machine learning. So when you have such complex issues, the EU and any other body, it doesn't have to be a union, it can be a state that has devoted a lot of time on a given issue, can share it, or at the very least, it can react to given situations. And this is the value really of multilateral diplomacy that I think is very often missed by non-diplomats. And that is that outcomes are important, but the process is as important, if not more important, exactly because of these reasons. You have a new development, you have reactions from the different actors, and by the tone of the reactions, by the type of the reactions, you can get a lot of information. So when the EU now reacts to given situations, it is given a lot of information to others that can think about it either as in opposition or by accepting the logic that is given in it. And there's a lot of value in that. So to finish the first aspect of your question, which is the aspect of the connections of it, I would really single out these kinds of things. To get to the specific questions that were posed in the chat, and one was that the Secretary General has called for a ban. He did a few years ago. And it is an important part. His statements have been varying. Obviously, he's kept to the importance of the process, but the specifics have matured within the process of the GG, as they have by other actors that they're commenting on it, including the Secretary General. And this is what it's about. You have a very complex process. And to bring back the metaphor earlier of a big cruise ship going, you sometimes need some tugboats to pull in one direction and to pull in another direction. I mentioned earlier the killer robots. There is the campaign to stop killer robots, and it's an incredible organization of a lot of really dedicated network of many different organizations that have given it. They've put the frame of killer robots. Now, I've said earlier that I don't agree with the frame because I think it simplifies things, but the value of the tugboat of pulling the process in one direction or another is valuable. It gives the whole process a lot more wealth in that regard. So, and to finish with the first question, what's in store? Well, the RefCon. This is where it's heading. It was supposed to be again the end of this year. Because of the delays of resulting from COVID-19, it might get postponed to early next year, but not necessarily. It is still possible to be held this year. But this is where we will see where we're at in terms of outcomes. The process, as I've argued, has done a lot of good, but now we come to a point of, okay, what is the outcome? And the outcome need not be, again, this is a norm. It can be, again, a direction in which way to go from here. And I'll repeat, it is a very highly complex process. I can just get any one aspect and start unraveling it for you to see how complex it is. You know, like the one I said before, that we're not talking about a weapon, but any weapon that can use machine learning. We're talking about conventional weapons in the CCW, not yet strategic weapons of mass destruction, but still. So when you have such high complexity, you really need to get it right. And until then, you've got to keep on talking, because the alternative is not necessarily the absence of work in this field, as I say this in my farewell thoughts, but really the possibility of everybody going back to their garages, doing things on their own, not checking what the others are doing, and doing it out of fear that somebody else is going to do something faster, which means in this process that they might deploy weapons that are not ready to be deployed because there's the lack of communication. So communication is key.
Thank you, Ljupčo. I think, well, if anything, we can certainly take out of these discussions by you and Katarina is that the process is going on, it's getting more mature, and the value of the process is something we should respect more. And I think we had the same note last month when we had, as a special guest, the chair of the Open-Ended Working Group on Cyber, who also underlined the importance of the process, but that ultimately we'll have to come up to some results. We'll have to wrap up this discussion, at least for today, on AI here, because we have more of the trends and topics to cover. But please stay, and Ljupčo, you can stay with us if you can in chat and continue the discussions. It seems like we'll have to organize a special session on all of this as a separate track. Let's move on with the trends. The second trend of the month is data breaches and data scrapping, and you've probably read this news about Facebook and LinkedIn leaked personal data, and there is a big question: what is scrapping, what is leaking, what is hacking, and so on. So I pass the floor now to my colleague Stephanie, who can drive a little bit through what has actually happened and how can we understand this difference. Stephanie, welcome, and the screen is yours.
So, yeah, so the two main incidents that brought this on as a trend was the fact that, as you're saying, Vlada, there were two quite large data, let's call them leaks for the time being. So the first is regarding the Facebook. Over 500 million users had their data, personal data put out there, basically. And the second concerns LinkedIn. Again, over 500 million users whose personal data were leaked. So we can consider even the fact that there were 2 breaches in a week a trend, but it's not a nice trend, of course. What we found interesting was what the companies said, and here I'll quote. So what Facebook said was that the vulnerability was identified and fixed in 2019, but it then changed. It then changed the version to put this in the context of May 2018, when the GDPR actually came into effect. And it also said that the breach was not the result of Facebook systems being hacked. So hey, it's not our fault, but of the data being scraped. So the data being lifted, usually through a vulnerability in this case, but we'll get to that. What did LinkedIn say? LinkedIn said that, and here again I'm quoting, that the data is actually an aggregation of data from a number of websites and companies. It does not include publicly viewable member profile data. That appears to have been scraped from LinkedIn. So this was not LinkedIn data breach. So essentially what the companies are saying is, hey, the information was already out there, and what happened was that either maliciously or, well, that we'll have to see, that the data was scraped, which was lifted. Essentially, it was probably unsecured public data that was lifted and put out there. And this actually raises a few questions. And the first is, if we look at what the data that we as users share publicly versus not publicly, my question would be, is Facebook and LinkedIn saying that the data was information that the users themselves posted publicly? If you think about it, it's a little bit hard to digest, because there is some really personal data there, biographical information, etc., which I'm not sure that the users would have shared. Well, let's say I don't know there, but it's a question to be asked. The second question is that if the data was scraped, does it mean that the companies do not have any responsibility? So is what they're saying meant to exonerate them from responsibility, and will they succeed? Obviously, they want to shift things, and the answer to this, hopefully, will emerge from the many investigations that have been launched. A third related question is, if someone else was responsible for this data scraping, what will these two companies do next? Will they take legal action against the parties, the entities who scraped and published the data? So what will they do next? And these are all questions that have emerged, and more questions will arise. We'll also be keeping our eyes open on, hopefully there won't be any other leaks, but judging by the frequency of the leaks, I'm sure there will be more. So we'll be keeping our eyes open on what the companies will say. And that's it from my end, Vlada.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think you open more questions than really answers. And it seems like that the companies are actually trying to tweak the current sort of regulatory compliance into finding different ways to explain how the data and what type of data leaked. But we will certainly follow that more closely. I want to bring back Sonia to see whether there are any interesting inputs in the chat, whether related to this topic or also AI. You can just run through them. And let's see what's happening in the chat. Sonia.
Yes, the discussion on AI and laws continued in the chat. And also, perhaps slightly off topic, it was said like how budgets maybe would be better used if they were spent on combating pandemics instead of on weapons. But the thing is, I am very sorry. Okay, so since Richard Hill has said, since many countries have increased their military budgets during the pandemic, in some cases, they have even increased it as a percentage of the GDP. And before that, what was discussed is, okay, wait a minute. I am very, very sorry. 1 second. Sorry.
Well, it's good. It shows that the chat was quite active, I guess. I have that luck that I don't have to watch at the chat window. But anyhow, Sonia, if you wish, I mean, you can keep the rest for the last last round. So let's move on with the third trend of the month, and then we'll come back to the chat once again. The third trend of the month is actually about the US response to cybersecurity, to cyber attacks, and particularly the SolarWinds cyber attack, which struck the end of last year, attributed by the US and a number of its partners to Russia. And there was a lot of discussions about how the US will respond to that, whether we'll see something new. So I'll bring in my colleague Pavlina from US, actually from DC, to maybe help us understand what has happened now, what is the new, if it is new at all, response or the way of response by the US, and how can we understand that? Pavlina.
Thank you, Vlada. So in the last month, the US intelligence agencies, FBI, NSA, and CISA, have issued a statement attributing the SolarWinds attack to Russia, stating, and I quote, "This work indicates that an APT actor, likely Russian in origin, is responsible, and this was and continues to be an intelligence gathering effort." So it is interesting that a couple of weeks ago, President Biden already announced there will be a two-pronged response to SolarWinds attack. On one side, the response we have seen this month, and on the other side, the response which would be only visible by Russia. And this month, the US president sanctioned Russia by an executive order through sanctioning 40 Russian individuals and companies, including 10 companies related to Russian intelligence gathering organizations. And Russia, in retaliation, expelled 10 diplomats from its territory. So experts say that even though this exchange is taking place, there is room for negotiations. On one side, President Biden has announced that there is a room for tensions to de-escalate. And on the other side, the Russians didn't refuse this offer. So there may be some kind of discussion or a summit on this issue. Now, with regards to response of others to SolarWinds attack, US allies were never shy to attribute attack on the US to China or Russia. However, this time we see a more pronounced discussion, which probably took place already in advance of this announcement, by NATO, supporting US position and attributing attack to Russia, as well as EU, UK, and Canada, who said that also their governments and businesses were affected by SolarWinds. Now we have an open question, what happens next, of course, whether US will now retaliate through cyber attack on Russia, and what will the other parties do, including NATO and other countries. One thing to mention in this respect is also the wording of the attribution by the US intelligence agencies, stating it is an intelligence gathering effort, meaning espionage. So strictly, we're not talking about cyber attack as such, which would then trigger some kind of response by a country. So it is a very complicated field, which we will look at the developments further. I think that's about it for me. I'm trying to keep it short so we have some time for questions also.
Thank you, Pavlina. A quick question straight from me is this something that we can actually say is a new approach? Because there was a lot of expectations how Biden administration would actually act, that the previous, even sort of personal sanctions and indications were not enough. And at the same time, we have seen Biden's administration actually coming a couple of weeks ahead of this, publicly saying that they will probably go two tracks. One is what will be visible, this is what we see, and the other one which will be actually a counterattack to some of the Russian political structures and so on. So are we seeing a shift, or this is still the same old story? What are the reflections in the US?
The reflections are that there is a shift in diplomatic approach to these attacks as such. There is way more investigation on the side. For example, NATO had its own investigation into SolarWinds, and there's more dialogue between NATO, US, and its allies on the cyber attacks, on its effects, And we must not forget that this attack is still ongoing. So I do not think this is the last we see as far as sanctions and maybe some kind of retributions towards Russia. But as far as the newness, it is new in a sense that it is more coordinated and more impactful towards Russia when other actors, not only US, comes out and attributes the espionage to Russia.
Thanks, Paulina. We'll definitely keep monitoring on these trends in the next months. Before running through, we have to wrap up with the trends. Before running into the next steps, I wanted to bring in Jovan. Jovan is, well, we try to bring him occasionally as a zoom out perspective in a way of maybe the three trends. So Jovan, what would be your zoom out perspectives on these three trends or more generally?
Thank you, Vlada. It's great to reconnect. There are a few points which are clear. One is that European Union regulation of AI is not going to be as revolutionary as GDPR. As a matter of fact, GDPR already regulates a lot of AI because for AI you need the data, and GDPR regulates use of data, including for processing and AI. Therefore, I think that would be I would say much more modest an impact than GDPR because of the existing coverage of GDPR. Second point, which is extremely important, EU brought a bit of reality into the discussion of AI. AI narratives are full of hype. And what the EU did in this context brought real question. What is new in it? Can we regulate AI with existing rules? And you can find many existing rules that can apply to AI. And then they said, okay, but there are risk issues and this gradation of risks. And they said, here we have some risks. Now it is extremely important to deflate the AI hype and to have realistic discussion. And in that sense, EU and AI will play important way on positioning EU's digital third way, which President Macron introduced at Internet Governance Forum in Paris a few years ago, obviously between United States and China. Now that approach is not going to be equidistance approach, because obviously EU shares a lot of values, human rights with United States, but also have concerns when it comes to, in particular, big flow of data across the Atlantic from European Union to the United States and use of data. And that will be an interesting around AI issues, use of data, free use of data. There will be this fine-tuning positioning of EU as a third actor in the digital space, but not third actors with equidistance approach between US and China, but actor which will have more analog approach, agreeing on most cases related to values and human rights to the United States, but then on practical commercial issues, probably getting closer to the Chinese position. Therefore, that would be interesting to monitor. In brief, nothing new. GDPR is already regulating a lot. Great deflating of the AI hype. And third one is a question of AI as a way to calibrate EU's third way. Last point, a lot of new insights can be made in Geneva, let's say. IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, deals more or less with the similar issues as European Union AI proposes, dealing with risks. Are they likely? Very likely. Therefore, in Geneva, we'll be trying to connect these dots and apply knowledge from AI and other sectors, for climate change to AI and other related sectors. Over to you, Vlada.
Thank you, Jovan, for this zoom out. Definitely a lot on the table, but we'll be following on that. Before we move on, let me quickly get back to Sonia. Couple of tweets, Sonia, and then we can move on with the remaining coverage. Sonia, anything standing out in the chat?
Yes, from Deidre and Pavlina to Jovan. She's saying we could begin by finding and popularizing a new and more accurate way than label it artificial intelligence. And more specific one from Pavlina to Wolfgang's earlier comments, which was asking whether it made sense to avoid defining a red line between espionage and attack, which is UN Charter 2.4, which Paulina said to, in the sense of 2.4, the right to self-defense, according to Article 51, could also be invoked. And there's room for diplomacy by preserving this. And the discussion is continuing between Wolfgang, but I guess there will be more once you get back to me again. And apologies for the drop earlier again. Thank you a lot, Sonia. Well, keep on discussing in the chat, certainly. And in the meantime, we move on. And now I turn actually to you again to sort of vote for the top trend of the month, according to you. We again offer the same 3 trends that we mentioned at the beginning, but you can certainly add more trends in the chat. So open in another browser, don't get out of the Zoom, open menti.com, type the number that you can see in the top of the screen, and then simply pick your vote out of these 3. I know that we favorized AI this month because we had a vast coverage, but that shouldn't influence you. Just pick whatever out of the 3 you think is most dominant. And if you have any other trend that you would like to emphasize, just post it in the chat and we'll summarize all of that. While you vote, so go on, you can still memorize the number for Menti. We'll move on running through the barometer quickly and then come back to see the results of the poll. Digital barometer, as some of you that are regular with us know, we try to measure the pressure in different areas of digital policy. Most of those we actually covered in the trends part, but there is one interesting bit that we might still add, and that is the high pressure in the field of internet economy and e-commerce. There are 2 notable developments there, basically. One is related to antitrust lawsuits. We have been covering widely what's happening in the US and the EU, but increasingly we also see other countries such as China, Russia, and India coming up with antitrust lawsuits. So that shows basically that the power of giant tech companies, tech giants, is considered as an issue to governments worldwide, not just in US and the EU. And the second bit is from the world of taxation, basically, that the US has proposed a global minimum tax for companies, which is basically a welcome news to the ongoing global discussions and process within the OECD. And we recall some coverage that we had in the past, that this process was started last year. And now with the change of the US position, we may also see the change in the process and negotiations turning to full speed. To look at more updates, just go to Digital Watch Observatory website and you'll have all the set of updates there to monitor regularly. Coming back briefly to the poll to see what are the results and what might be the top trend of yours. Obviously the AI is the dominant one. I'm trying to find the best way so that you can see, but obviously that will be this way. Actually, the AI is the dominant one. I hope we didn't impact your decision too much. But we'll keep following on that one. Now, what comes in this briefing in this last part is actually run through what we can expect in May. So the events of the next month, what Diplo will offer to you in May, and lastly, around the world with the regional updates. And there I invite my colleague Andriana, who will take over the floor and basically lead us to what's coming in May, and then this tour around the globe. Andriana, the floor is yours, and I'll remove myself. I'll come back later. Andriana.
Thank you, Vlada. The digital policy calendar is always rich with events, and now we have over 20 mapped on Digital Watch. I selected these to direct your attention to them. This was my arbitrary decision, and you might not agree, which is why I invite you to drop a comment in the chat with the hashtag events and let us know what you think are the most important events, and also if we missed any. Next week, we have the STI Forum. This is the Science, Technology and Innovation Forum. It's an annual event. This is the 6th one. And we will be reporting from selected sessions. You will be able to find those reports on Digital Watch. We will also promote them to social media. So if you follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, you will definitely see the links that lead to our reports. And then we will also report from the World Summit on Information Society. It's the final week of the forum. Last year, the summit shifted to a year-round event. It's organized by the ITU still, and we will report from the sessions that will occur in that particular week you see on the screen. Also available on Digital Watch, and you will also be able to see this on our social media. And then we have the week after that, the final substantive session of the 6th UNGG. Unlike the UNGG we were talking about at the beginning, this one is the Cyber GG, and it remains the most mysterious of all the UN cyber processes. I'm putting it out there right now because while we might not know much right now, we will probably be back with this topic in May. It will be interesting to see, considering that the last UGGs haven't concluded in reports. The last report was in 2015, so that's something definitely to watch. And then at the very end of May and stretching into June, we have the School on Internet Governance, Digital Policies and Innovation, also called CD. It's designed for graduate students and professionals who want to learn more about digital innovation and who want to learn how digital technologies impact our societies and economies. This is particularly directed to the residents of the Southeastern European region, but it's also open to others as well. I think this would be the perfect moment to dig into the events Diplo is preparing for the month of May. And now I invite my colleague Marco to go through these events with us. Marco, are you with us?
Yes, thank you, Andrea.
Over to you.
Thank you. A little quick overview on what our audience can expect from us in the upcoming weeks when it comes to events, courses, and also the news and our newsletters. When it comes to the events, we will have our monthly events, parts of the 12 tours to navigate digital Geneva. This is a follow-up to the launch of the Geneva Digital Atlas. We are navigating the Geneva digital policy scene through a specific digital policy issue every month. Last month was standardization, and this month, tomorrow actually, is about digital economy, trade and finance. There is still time to register as the event will take place tomorrow at 11 a.m. Geneva time. And as you know, it will be an interesting way to discuss also a series of very interesting developments. Among things, we just talked about AI today, but 2021 will be a very rich year when it comes to e-commerce and the digital economy. And the following month, in May, there will be also the other tour, the following tour that will be about digital and environment. We have our usual monthly events, which are the web debate, which is on diplomatic responses to COVID crisis, as well as our masterclass series about the history of diplomacy. When it comes on of the courses, May is also a very rich month. As you can see from the slide, we have the start of 5 main months, 5 main courses. The first ones will be 21st century diplomacy, e-diplomacy, and the other two whose deadline is still open for application will be the cybersecurity course and the digital commerce course. For these last two, in particular the cybersecurity course, the deadline is open for applications until the 1st of May. And the second one, the digital commerce course, which is open not only to Geneva-based diplomats, but also for officials from the capitals and based elsewhere in the world. Application deadline is the 17th of May. I invite you to visit our diplomacy.edu/courses page to find all the modalities for application and also the related deadlines. The last part is about what to expect from us when it comes to content. On the one hand, we have our recently launched weekly digests, If you want to stay on top of digital policy with a weekly appointment instead of just waiting for our monthly newsletter, every Friday you receive a condensed version of what has happened in the previous week, highlights, and a short analysis of these developments by the end of each week. On the other hand, we will always publish our monthly newsletter, which will come up at the end of the month and at the beginning. So that is in a few days. So stay tuned for these resources. Back to you, Vlada and Adriana.
Thank you, Marco, for that overview of our activities. And now we move to our trip around the world. And the regional updates are next. First, we go to Asia, where we have Amrita. Amrita will tell us more. Well, she will continue in a way from the last month's trends, which she also presented, and it will be about big tech. This time it's in China and Australia. Amrita, over to you.
Hello and welcome to the regional update from Asia for the month of April. This month, China's State Administration for Market Regulation imposed a record fine of $2.8 billion on Alibaba for having implemented anti-competitive business practices. Alibaba has been accused of adopting exclusionary practices, preventing third-party businesses from selling their goods on other platforms that hindered competition in online retail, affecting innovation in the internet economy, and harming consumers' interest. While experts believe this fine that represents 4% of Alibaba's domestic sales in 2019 will not dent the company, however, Alibaba's woes are far from over. The regulator is now investigating a joint venture between Alibaba Group and Minmetal's development. It may be mentioned that Beijing is increasingly becoming concerned of the growing market power of tech giants and since December last year, coming down heavily on them. It is expected this trend will continue for some more time. In Australia, a federal court has ruled that Google violated Australian laws over its location data collection policy. The court found that between 2017 and 2018, Google misled Android users by collecting and storing their personal identifiable location information through its web and app activity setting, even when they had opted out of sharing location history data. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, who had filed the case, welcomed the decision and announced it is seeking penalties against Google. The Commission further stated that this decision sends out a strong message to tech companies not to mislead their customers. Will this investigation lead other countries in the region to launch such investigations? Perhaps. We will have to wait and watch. That's all from me for this month. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita. 2 more stops to go. We go now to Egypt, where we have Noha Fati, who will tell us more about the Middle East and North African policy updates. I believe Noha will be speaking about the private sector initiatives that will help recover the economies considering the effects from the pandemic. Noha, over to you.
Hello, this is Noha Fati. I cover internet governance developments in the Middle East and North Africa region. This month, a number of private companies unveiled different initiatives to support economic recovery amid COVID-19 crisis, promote financial inclusion and innovation, and boost the growth of digital economy in the MENA region. The first initiative is part of a long-term partnership between MasterCard and Uber. The two companies announced a new cooperation to enhance digital payments and promote financial inclusion in the MENA region. Within this initiative, MasterCard will deploy single infrastructure to accommodate a broad range of payments needs in the region, including Uber Rides and Uber for Business. This will further facilitate cashless payments, drive digital payment acceptance, and reward loyalty while improving Uber's continued social impact initiative. Another initiative was announced by MasterCard and GEDA, Saudi Arabia-based fintech company. The two companies unveiled a new partnership to accept MasterCard payments on tap-on-phone solution in Saudi Arabia. GEDA will be the first fintech company to roll out this contactless payment acceptance technology across the country, which will enable businesses to use smartphones as payment acceptance devices. Also, Amazon Payment Services announced waiving all fees for new micro, small, and medium enterprises wishing to benefit from its services in Egypt. The company will waive all account setup and maintenance fees for MSMEs for its digital payment service. The initiative, which will be implemented in Egypt until end of June 2021, will be supported by Amazon's partner banks in Egypt, including Commercial International Bank and Bank Masr, as well as Robusta and Zivendo. Thank you.
Thank you, Noha. And the last stop for today is the Latin American and Caribbean region. We have Pedro waiting for us in Brazil, and Pedro will tell us more about the trending topic in the region, and that will be privacy and data protection this month. Pedro, over to you.
This month's trend in the Latin American and Caribbean region concerns privacy and data protection issues. The Mexican Senate has approved the creation of a national standard for mobile telecommunications, which requires citizens to provide biometric information in order to acquire or retain mobile phone services. Citizens must submit their biometric information to the government in the next 2 years. To justify this decision, Mexican policymakers have argued that the current available mechanism, which involves SIM card registration, is not enough to prosecute criminals who use mobile phones to commit crimes. Civil society has expressed their concerns for the privacy rights of Mexican citizens and have criticized the new biometric mobile phone registry, noting that criminals are not likely to use the real information or even register, that the registry would be a single point of attack for potential criminals wanting to steal personal information, and that it might facilitate state surveillance. As the May 15 deadline for WhatsApp business users to accept the new privacy policy approaches, concerns in WhatsApp's second largest market, Brazil, arises. As of February 2021, 1 out of 5 catalogs on the WhatsApp business app worldwide were based in Brazil. Now, a consumer protection organization has requested that the Ministry of Justice and Brazil's Data Protection Authority suspend WhatsApp's new privacy policy. The organization has argued that the app's policy is not in accordance with the country's new data protection legislation. It also requested that the app cease sharing its users' metadata with other companies from the same group, such as Facebook and Instagram.
Thank you, Pedro, for those updates. We will definitely be watching the Mexico one, considering the fact that there are 2 more years for citizens to have to submit their data. There's already been news that a judge has partially blocked the law, and there might be a full block coming on. We'll see what happens in the following months.
Thank you, Andriana. Well, I do hope we'll have some chance to visit these parts of the world soon. In the meantime, thank you for being today with us. Just a kind reminder at the end, the newsletter is coming very soon, so stay tuned. And secondly, 2 new courses. The deadlines for applications are quite soon. Visit the courses page on Diplo's website and join us. And well, if not earlier, then see you at the end of May, last Tuesday of the month. There will be 25th of May, same time, same place. Thank you and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.